And we have some theories of emotion. So we're going to go over the three major theories, the James Lange theory, the Canon Bar theory, and the Shakhtar theory. Okay, so the first one is the James Lange theory. So this theory came about just at the end of the 19th century. So James Lange theory suggests that an emotion is the result of an immediate physiological response to a stimulus and not the other way around. So at the time, the common sense way of thinking was that we would have this subjective experience of fear when we were confronted with an aversive stimulus. And upon understanding that we're experiencing fear, our body would then mount this autonomic response and would continue with that sympathetic response. However, the James Lange theory kind of challenged that, and it basically said it's the other way around. So it basically said that your body responds automatically to whatever that stimulus is, and then because you are able to identify what is happening with your body, that creates the subjective experience of the emotion, so for fear. So if we look down at the diagram at the bottom, is basically what I was just saying. So that first common sense theory, we have the stimulus, the person is going to react with fear, and then the body is going to respond, arousal. So that would be increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure, vasodilation, giving off heat. So that was the common sense theory. But then the James Lange theory said that the first thing that happens chronologically when you are exposed to an aversive stimulus, like say a growling wolf, you're going to have a bodily response first. That physiological response is going to occur first, and then it is our recognition of our own body, internally of our own body. It's our recognition of that specific state of arousal that creates the experience of fear. So evidence that supports this theory: altering breathing patterns can lead to changes in emotional state. So we're, altering our autonomic response, and then that should in turn alter our subjective emotional experience, which it does seem like that happens. So that's something to keep in mind. And we also have those with spine damage who are unable to respond to stimuli with physiological arousal will also experience reduced emotion. So these are people who their nervous system has sort of been severed at a specific point that reduces their ability to experience physiological arousal. So their sympathetic response is not going to be as strong as someone who didn't have spine damage. And in these cases, we actually see that these people do experience reduced emotions. So that's another, pretty important point of supporting evidence for this theory. We have criticisms of the theory as well, though. Some emotions share the same physiological state. So fear and sexual arousal, for example, if you're not looking at the two of those emotions subjectively, and we were just, taking the vitals and just looking at the physiological response of an individual that's in a state of fear and an individual that's in a state of sexual arousal, we would get extremely, extremely similar numbers. So according to the James Lange theory, there's really an assumption that one sort of physiological state should correspond to one emotion, because our deciphering of that emotion is dependent on how we see our own physiological state. So we're not really looking at the situation. We're just the only factor, according to the James Lange theory, that produces the emotion is our response to our own physiological arousal. So in that case, it sort of poses a problem that we have similar physiological states that pair up to different emotions. And then also the theory assumes that we're able to label these physical states accurately. So not only should there be one-on-one with these physiological states, but we have to be able to identify and label these physiological states very quickly. So there's not necessarily a lot of evidence that says that's exactly what's going on. So after the James Lange theory, Walter Cannon and grad student Philip Bard came up with this theory in response to that theory. So the Canon Bar theory basically claims that physiological response and emotional response occur simultaneously and independently. So there is no cause and effect relationship between the two. So if we go down and we look, the stimulus over here is going to be a snarling dog. First response, we're going to see that snarling dog, subcortical brain activity. We're going to realize the situation. And then the second response, at the same time and independently, we are going to have that autonomic response and that subjective conscious fear. So this theory is able to explain the overlap in physiological state between emotions like fear and sexual arousal, because we no longer have to have that sort of one-on-one relationship between physiological states and subjective fear and those different types of emotions. So it also struggles, however, to explain why the emotional state can change by changing physiological state. So like we were talking about before, changing those breathing patterns, according to the James Lang theory, if we change our breathing patterns, that would change the autonomic response, which would change the emotional state. So that makes sense. But if we're looking at that same phenomenon through the lens of the Canon Bar theory, if we change our breathing, we could supposedly change the autonomic nervous system functioning, but that, according to the Canon Bar theory, is completely independent from our actual emotional processing. So our state of arousal, regardless if it's high or low, should have no bearing on the actual emotional state. So it doesn't really do a good job to explain why, using breathing techniques can either heighten or lower our physiological state of arousal. And then the third theory that you should definitely be able to know and identify for the MCAT is called the Shakhtar theory. So according to this theory, we experience a physiological arousal first in response to a stimulus. So that's very similar to the James Lang theory. However, it is then our cognitive appraisal of the situation that leads to an emotional response. So now we're talking about cognitive appraisal of our external environment. So similar to the James Lang theory, but in the Shakhtar theory, it is situational appraisal rather than immediate one-to-one correlation that results in this emotional response. So remember, when we're talking about the James Lang theory, it's the same as this one, where we're first going to experience that physiological arousal. But according to the James Lang theory, what happens after that is it's pretty immediate. We recognize what our body is doing, and then just from that recognition alone, we have our emotion state. The Shakhtar theory is a little bit more comprehensive and sort of explains situational context. So it's the same thing. We see a snarling dog. We get that physiological arousal. The only thing that's different, though, is in order to interpret that physiological arousal, we use the sort of situational context of what's actually going on. So we're not just looking at our own physiological state, we're looking at the actual situation that we're in. So we will look over, see that there's a dog that is snarling his teeth and growling, and we would know from past experiences that we are in trouble. And that cognitive appraisal would produce that conscious feeling of fear. So with the Shakhtar theory, it's got a similar timeline as the James Lang theory. We're just taking into consideration cognitive appraisal of our outside environment. So this theory accurately explains the similar physiological state, but different emotion problem. What we were talking about before, how the James Lang theory needs that sort of one-to-one with physiological state and emotions. This solves that problem because we have that cognitive appraisal. So we could have a similar physiological state, say our last example, fear and sexual arousal, but because in the Shakhtar theory, it accounts for that cognitive appraisal, we would be able to consciously decipher if we are in a situation that calls for fear or a situation that calls for sexual arousal. So it definitely explains that much better than the James Lang theory. And like the Canon Bar theory, though, this theory does not explain the effect of changing behavior to alter the cognitive aspects of emotion. So all of these theories really do have their setbacks, and they have points that support them. So like a lot of theories that we study in the soft sciences, it's just really a good idea to know all of the theories, because the fact of the matter is the truth is usually some sort of blending of multiple of the leading theories. We can get useful information from all of these theories, from different pieces of each of these. Quickly, the role of neuroscience. So emotional circuits in the brain have eluded neuroscientists for years. We're still, looking at the brain, trying to connect neuroscience to actual consciousness. So once thought emotional center model of mapping specific emotions to specific brain areas proved to be too simplistic, and emotions work more as circuits throughout the brain with similar emotions sharing similar patterns. So that's just one example of, how we have to sort of restructure the way we look at neuroscience when we're trying to figure out these things that have psychological consequences. So at one point, we may have thought that there was a specific emotional center in the brain or specific parts of the brain that are responsible for specific emotions. But, with technology, imaging technology, better methodology for when we conduct clinical research, we start to realize the picture is a little bit different. So if you look at this diagram, we see these two almost looks like 3D, like MRIs. So we have contentment and anger, and that's basically showing the parts of the brain that light up when the patient is subjectively reporting these experiences. And they will light up in those same exact spots when the person is experiencing a similar emotional state. So it's more of an emotional circuit throughout the entire brain than having these little emotional centers specifically in the brain for specific parts of for specific emotions. And similar emotions, although they're slightly different, will probably use similar, although slightly different circuits in the brain. So there's a lot that we don't know about, and there's not too much that's going to be on the MCAT about the role of neuroscience in emotion, but it's definitely important to know. Because we have the limbic system as well, which will more so be on the MCAT. It'll be a lot higher yield than the previous slide. So the limbic system is just a collection of structures in the brain that is involved in the behavioral and emotional response. We do have some lectures on the brain. They might not be in this 15-week supplement, but they might be in the original 15-week MCAT course. So if you need to brush up, I definitely recommend going back. So the amygdala is an almond-shaped structure located deep in the brain that controls much of the emotional response, and it can communicate directly with the hypothalamus. So the amygdala, it's most famously implicated in aggression and fear processing, but it also does play a larger role in other emotional processing as well. So the hypothalamus can control the body's physiological response, the sympathetic response to danger, say. So the hypothalamus has control of that HPA axis as well. And it has control, it's able to, make the body release these chemicals, these hormones that are important for the sympathetic response, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, say. So the amygdala can also send information to the prefrontal cortex where decisions, behavioral responses to the stimulus can be generated. So the prefrontal cortex, as you should know, is towards the front of your brain. It's in the cerebrum. Specifically, it's the frontal lobe. And that's the part of your brain that is important for decision-making, judgment, and planning. So the amygdala also coordinates with the prefrontal cortex because a lot of times if there are those sort of primal emotions, like you're confronted with fear or something like that, you really have to make quick decisions. So where better to send this information than the decision-making center of the brain? All right, so this brings us to our first review question. Read this over. Once you're done, I would take about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, just because there are a lot of words. But pause the video right now. When you unpause it, we'll go over it. Okay, so which of the following answers does not accurately match the specific theory of emotion with its correct order of events? So if you got C, you are correct, and we will go over it. So according to the Shakhtar theory, a boy who is confronted with a growling dog will experience an autonomic physiological response and emotional response that are independent of each other. So that is not correct. The Shakhtar theory does not say that the emotional and physiological response are independent. That is the Canon Bar Theory. So just because the wrong theory was listed in A, it's incorrect. So B, according to the James Lang theory, a boy who is confronted with a growling dog will experience an autonomic physiological response, followed by an evaluation of the current situation as a dangerous one that should evoke fear, resulting finally in the emotional response. So we're sort of in the right order, but again, what you have to watch out for is that we're talking about the James Lang theory, so there should be absolutely no cognitive appraisal of the situation. The James Lang theory, what the autonomic response is directly responsible for the emotional state. There's no cognitive appraisal. There is no consideration of the outward situation at all. So B is incorrect. D, according to the Canon Bar Theory, a boy who is confronted with a growling dog will experience an autonomic physiological response followed only by immediate labeling of this arousal, resulting finally in the emotional response. So that's actually describing the James Lang theory. It's in the right order, and only the immediate labeling of the arousal results in the emotional response. So that's the James Lang theory, not the Canon Bar theory. So that's why that's incorrect. And then we have C, the correct answer. So according to the Shakhtar theory, we have blah, 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 followed by an evaluation of the current situation as a dangerous one that should evoke fear, resulting finally in the emotional response. So in C, we finally have the correct name of the theory matching the correct order of events that should unfold according to it.